Yes, we can hear you, whoever said that.
Okay,
So,
let me mute them.
David Clavel, I can, yeah, there you're muted now. Thank you. And Paulette, if you'd mute yourself, maybe I'll help do that. Okay. So welcome, friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our very special guest today, Professor David O'Brien on the history of Catholic social teaching. So first, again, let me ask everyone to mute yourselves and to write any questions in the chat link there. And I've asked David to speak for up to 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions and conversation for another 45 minutes. So we'll go maybe an hour and a half. And in a few days, I'll send out the Zoom recording link if you want to listen again. So everybody, let's begin with a little prayer. I invite us, if you want to just sit up and close your eyes and take a moment of silence. Just take a deep breath and relax and enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you very much. And friends, let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus here to our hearts and our circle, and ask God to give us all the blessings of peace and love and life and gospel nonviolence that we need to be God's holy beatitude people. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us now and bless us as we reflect with our friend David O'Brien on Catholic social teaching and your call that we work for racial, social, economic, and climate justice, for the abolition of racism and poverty and war and nuclear weapons and destroying the environment and all systemic violence and injustice, that we might truly follow ever more faithfully the nonviolent Jesus and be your beatitude people of universal love and active nonviolence, your beloved sons and daughters, your holy peacemakers. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So again, everybody, welcome. Very glad to have you all here. I'm coming to you from Durham, North Carolina today. One of the best developments really in the Catholic Church in our lifetimes has been these series of astonishing documents known as Catholic social teaching, going back to Pope Leo, to John the 23rd's Pacem in Terris, to the Second Vatican Council, and now to Pope Francis, his great documents, Laudato Si, and his World Day of Peace message on nonviolence. I think the Catholic social teaching is the real sign of hope in the Catholic Church. And it's a real help to help us live out the gospel. And Pope Francis, I think, has done a great job. He's really leading. And Dave, tell us all about it. I consider it a historic paradigm shift, moving the church, I hope, toward the total abolition of war, the just war theory. He's clearly ended any Catholic support of the death penalty and nuclear weapons and environmental destruction. And Dave and I were talking a couple of weeks ago. Orbis Books published a brand new book by Pope Francis called Against War. And it's astonishing. That's the title, Against War. It's everything he said on peace and war. And there's never been anything like it in the history of the Catholic Church. And it's just happened 2 weeks ago. So despite all the bad news, David, the way I look at it is we're actually living through an amazing development and transformation in the Catholic Church. And David, met David, we were reminiscing at the Pax Christi 50th anniversary conference in Assisi in 1995. And he wrote to me after my friend Dr. Paul Farmer died, and I immediately invited David to give us a Zoom here for the Beatitude Center. I consider Professor David O'Brien the foremost Catholic historian in the nation. And he's the Professor Emeritus of Loyola, Professor of Roman Catholic Studies at Holy Cross, College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts. He's a prolific writer. His books include American Catholics and Social Reform, The New Deal Years, The Renewal of American Catholicism, and Renewing the Earth, Catholic Documents on Peace, Justice, and Liberation. So everybody, please join me in giving a big Zoom round of applause for Professor David O'Brien. David, welcome. You're here among friends, and we're all happy to hear what you have to teach us. So I'm going to mute myself, and the floor is yours, David. Make yourself at home.
Thank you so much, John. So thank you for asking me. I'm speaking to you today from Agape, a nonviolent center celebrating its 40th anniversary here in rural central Massachusetts. And a lot of John Deere's Peace Movement friends are here to help the Shanley celebrate this remarkable work that they've done over 40 years now. And you'd all be proud to hear the amazing things that they've been able to do, trying to live out the gospel fully here in nonviolence community. So I'm speaking for Agape. I got to give you a few warnings before I start. First is I'm retired from Holy Cross almost 14 years now, and I have the feeling that when somebody asks me what I think now, it's like all this stuff has been bottled up because nobody's asked me in a long time, and it all pours out, and I talk a lot and I talk too fast. So I'll try not to do that, but I'm very grateful to have an opportunity to share some thoughts that I've had. And it's really good to be here. The other warning I often give people is that I'm not a theologian. I'm not even a religious studies professor. I went to graduate school to study American political history. And through a variety of accidents I consider providential, I stumbled into the Catholic worker movement when I started graduate school that opened me up to ideas about Catholicism I hadn't understood before. And about 10 years later, I was asked by the bishop to go to Notre Dame to help a young priest start some social action in our diocese. And I met Monsignor Jack Egan, and he kind of introduced me to social ministry across the country. And I even worked for the bishops for a year in the mid-70s on the bicentennial program that led to the call to action. But I am an American historian and not a theologian. And I've been interested in Catholic social teaching in the United States and in Catholic social action and social ministry in the history of the United States. And historians tend to try to put things in context, which is what I've always tried to do, to kind of understand ideas in context and then to understand their impact, how they were received in a particular place, in my case, the United States. The other thing is that I have a sense that history, I've always thought in teaching and working on history, is not just about the past, but it's about the past and the present and the future, in fact. Martin Marty, great figure in this tradition I come out of religious history, had a book one time called The Search for a Usable Future. And a lot of historical writing is about that. And one of the things I've written more recently was about the trajectory of US Catholic history. And I'm a little afraid we're a little bit too much, like Pope Francis worried the other day, looking backward and not forward. Aspirations and hope are a little bit sidelined in our church, struggling through so many problems. And I think that's really important. I think that'll come up in some of the things I have to say later. The final thing to say before I start a little history is I do believe Catholic social teaching is a very, very great gift that we have from our past and from our tradition. And it's as good a framework as one can find for trying to think about the moral and spiritual dimension of the experiences we have as citizens and as disciples. I think that because it holds firmly to the two poles of human dignity and human rights on the one hand, and human solidarity and unity on the other. And keeping those two together is really, really important. It also has the kind of Catholic both and that always a warning against making too quick a judgment one way or the other, but sometimes feeling that it's a both and rather than either or kind of proposition. And that's part of the richness, I think, of the tradition. It offers a Christian way, I think, towards unity and always oriented toward building a just peace, which is what we're all after. So Catholic social teaching is wonderful. We used to call it the best kept secret. It still is too much of a secret, I think. Some of the remarkable things John referred to that have happened in recent years are really a secret to many of our fellow Christians and our fellow Catholics here in the United States. Let me just go through the tradition a little bit with the historical glance. Leo the 13th, 1891 is usually where we date the beginning of modern Catholic social teaching. Pope Leo he did not invent encyclicals, but he wrote a lot of them. And he set out, I think, a kind of understanding of the Pope as a teacher, which has been somewhat of a mixed blessing. It sometimes comes in handy, but sometimes it gets us into trouble. The popes and bishops and priests thinking themselves primarily as teachers, but he did that. He wanted to guide the church as it entered what he thought of as a new era. He wanted to guide it, and he wrote encyclicals on politics, on philosophy. He was the one that kind of made the teachings of St. Thomas and scholasticism the Catholic philosophy, not a Catholic philosophy. And in politics, he tried to offer the church a way of thinking of itself independently of particular political forms, thinking more in terms of principles and standards, and being more flexible in dealing with emerging democracies and republics and that sort of thing. His predecessor, Pope Pius IX, and the bishops gathered at the First Vatican Council had kind of set the church in a stance of opposition to modernity. And Pope Leo was trying to lay a foundation for a somewhat more flexible stance of the church that would enable it to deal with the diversity around the world and with the diverse challenges it faced. When he wrote Rerum Novarum in 1891, he wrote it a little bit from a defensive posture. That is, liberalism and capitalism and industrial society were on a roll. There was a great sense of progress and a great sense of a new world being built that was positive. And all over the world, there was this kind of sense of optimism in the era before the First World War. And the church had been in defensive since the French Revolution. In Italy, the Pope, of course, had lost control of the Papal States just as recently as 1870. The Pope was a prisoner in the Vatican, surrounded by a hostile, new Italian nation state. So that was the kind of way they came out of the Pius IX era, locked into this opposition to modern society that had been spelled out in the Syllabus of Errors. He was trying to open up some channels for a more fluid kind of pastoral response to the situations they faced. And it's out of that framework that he listened to the concerns of Catholics in Germany and was very influenced by them as he wrote Rerum Novarum. In Germany, the new German nation state was established again in 1870, as just recently, and immediately was in a kind of conflict with the church over Catholic schools and over kind of privileges that the church had enjoyed in the southern parts of Germany, which were Catholic, whereas Prussia had really been the driving force to create the new German state, and it was Protestant and not sympathetic to Catholicism. So in that state, they did have, as part of liberalism, a Reichstag, a legislature, and there were votes now. They were moving in a democratic direction. And the church, in order to protect its interests, in order to forward and control kind of its ideals, did enter into politics in Germany. And Rerum Novarum grew out of that desire of the German church to respond to the concerns of the industrial working class. The church in 19th century Europe found support among aristocrats, among peasants who were threatened by modernity, by modern industrial capitalism. But there was more and more Catholics moving to cities, taking jobs in industry. And there was this great problem of, can the church remain close to the working class? And in Germany, in order to do so, they had formed a political party, the Center Party, which was a party to protect Catholic interests. And they were trying to find ways to respond to the needs of the working class. And that's where Rerum Novarum came from. And in that document, of course, he's known for really three things: the right of labor to organize and bargain collectively. That was one thing that's affirmed in it and became very important. The second was the idea of a living wage, that what we call the universal destination of goods, that God creates the world in order to meet human needs. People have a right to life and therefore to the means of sustaining life. And in this new thing, the proletariat, that way of sustaining life was wages, and wages should be sufficient to enable people to live in dignity, in full dignity. So the living wage idea. And then thirdly is that he affirmed the idea that the state had the obligation to intervene in the economy in ways to protect people, what we call social legislation. So he called for support for legislation by the state to protect people against sickness, accident, unemployment, and the problems of old age, what we would call social security, social legislation. So those were the three kind of takeaways from Rerum Novarum that were very important to the church in Germany, trying to build a strong central party that could compete with the socialists on the one hand and the more conservative nationalists on the other. In the United States, that document was received by a church which was very different than the church in Europe. It was a church growing, composed of working class immigrants with very few wealthy people. It was very much a church that was dependent upon and was pastoring people who were working in the mines and the factories of the country. In rural Minnesota, there was a young man named John A. Ryan. In the seminary, he read Rerum Novarum and the context of all kinds of fights going on in the country about how to have a just solution to problems of agriculture and of labor. And he read Rerum Novarum and decided to devote his life really to what he called the social gospel, a term he borrowed from the Protestants of the time. And Ryan was really the main interpreter of Rerum Novarum in the United States. Its impact was to A, give Catholics permission to join trade unions, in this country, independent trade unions. In England and the United States, independent trade unions, not necessarily trade unions with some link to the hierarchy. Secondly, John Ryan became the progressive voice for a living wage. His book on the living wage was the book that was the foundation for legislation for the first minimum wage laws. And in fact, Minnesota and Oregon, two states that passed early minimum wage laws, both of those states were led, the fight for them was led by priests. And in Oregon, a priest took over the chairmanship of the administration of the law when it was passed. So the living wage idea was something that really had some roots in Rerum Novarum and certainly has had a lot of support and was given support by Catholics because of the leadership of John A. Ryan. And then thirdly, Ryan became a kind of voice for what we call progressivism of that period within the Catholic Church. He was kind of a bridge between the progressive movement of kind of liberal and social reform and Catholics. He was even on the founding board of the American Civil Liberties Union. He joined a lot of the progressive organizations as a kind of token Catholic. But he also interpreted progressive reform for Catholic priests and bishops. And in 1919, in the wake of World War I, the bishops published a program of social reconstruction that was echoing all those principles and application of principles of Rerum Novarum. Strong trade unions, protection for living wages, and even proposals for cooperatives and for alternatives to the industrial capitalist order, more in the line of what Rerum Novarum had been after. So that was number one. Rerum Novarum had a big impact on the American church. It had a big impact on the American hierarchy as seen in the 1919 pastoral program. So jump ahead to 1931 and Quadragesimo Anno, usually the second text you get people to read in classes on Catholic social teaching. 1931, very different than 1891. World War I had intervened, and World War I left behind a sense of the failure of liberalism, the failure of industrial capitalism, this terrible, terrible war, and kind of liberalism and capitalism by 1931 with the Depression was on the defensive. Communists and socialists at the one end, nationalist thugs on the other. Mussolini had taken over Italy in 1922 and had reached an agreement with the Vatican to form the Papal States, the Lateran Treaty that is the foundation of the modern Papal States and Papal system. And those fights were going on in the streets in Austria, in Vienna, in Paris, and in Berlin. So it was a different era, and it was one where there was not much support any longer for democracy or for liberalism on continental Europe. And Quadragesimo Anno is written out of that situation. It's much less defensive than Rerum Novarum. It's almost like the Catholic Church taking the offensive and wanting to provide Catholics with a third way, a way that was not capitalism, and was not socialism, but was a Catholic way of thinking about society. Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years after Rerum Novarum is the title, but the subtitle is on the reconstruction of the social order. So they were really into reconstruction and not just reform. Rerum Novarum had been reform, this was reconstruction. And the proposals of the Pope had were for strong trade unions, but more, the trade unions should not only be means of protecting the rights of workers and improving their situation, but they should aim towards participating fully in the management of the firm, the industry, and the political economy as a whole. And on the other hand, professions should be so organized around their responsibilities for the common good, and the state should intervene to make sure that capital and labor work together for the common good. In fact, the phrase social justice is introduced into Catholic teaching in Quadragesimo Anno, and it's about 3 or 4 places in the text, and it always is a reference to the responsibility to promote the common good, the general welfare, the public interest, if you will. Distributive justice is a phrase that has to do with the distribution of wealth and income. So Quadragesimo Anno had an impact that was interpreted in Europe in ways that Europe and Latin America and around the world in ways that were kind of associated with opposition to capitalism, but also opposition to socialism toward a more corporate kind of organization of society, often identified with extremely conservative, we would call kind of right-wing political movements throughout the world. In this country, though, John Ryan and his friends interpreted it really through the lens of American experience, where we did have a depression, we had a setback, but it was more the sense that this was unnecessary. It was want in the midst of plenty. And the country could be rebuilt in ways that had the resources to rebuild, to continue to support democracy. So it was interpreted here strongly about the support for trade unionism. The 30s are the great organizing era of industrial trade unions, and Catholics had not only a opportunity to participate, some bishops said they had an obligation to join unions. Jesuits had labor schools around the country to help Catholics become good, effective trade union members. There was no great support for the Wagner Act and for the right of labor to organize and bargain collectively. Support for social insurance, again, from Quadragesimo Anno and Rerum Novarum, were both interpreted in ways that were very supportive of New Deal social insurance. Some of the early New Deal things like the National Recovery Act of 1933 almost had a kind of echo of Rerum Novarum's reorganization of the political economy in a more cooperative direction, but that was thrown out by the Supreme Court in 1935. And the later New Deal went more to antitrust work and to distributive justice, trying to get better wages, hours, and working conditions in order to revive the economy. John Ryan interpreted some of the reconstruction of the social order ideas in a ways that were about industrial democracy. He called the systems of industrial democracy. And the big point I think they all drew out of this was that everybody, workers, owners, managers, professionals, all had an obligation to work for the common good. And there had to be, in order to do that, they had to be organized effectively. Organized industries and professions is what the phrase was. And the other thing about the period in the United States was that it would have been a John Deere's kind of hope. That is, everybody was into teaching the social encyclicals. Almost every national group, the Knights of Columbus, the American Alumni Association of College Graduates, Catholic action groups across the country, all were getting copies of the encyclicals, copies of pamphlets written by Jesuits about how to interpret the encyclicals, lots of efforts to promote a sense of social responsibility, to give young, educated Catholics an alternative to the socialists and communists. And then, of course, founded in that same period was the Catholic Worker Movement, which similarly was offering them an alternative way of engaging social and political responsibility while avoiding the dangers they thought of socialism and communism. So it was kind of the golden era of domestic social action in the 30s, though not much thought about war and peace, which is going to come a little bit later. Then let me jump with you from 1931 to 1962. And that's the year that Vatican II opened, John the 23rd's council. It's the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which inspired John the 23rd to write the encyclical Pacem in Terris. And here you have a very different, you had a defensive posture in 1991, a more offensive, let's recreate a social order in 1931. In 1962, everything had changed. I used to ask people when we talk about the 50th anniversary, it's now the 60th anniversary of Vatican II. Think of yourself as a bishop coming to Rome in 1962. You're 70 years old. 50 years earlier was 1912. The 50th anniversary of the 62, the 50th anniversary in 2012. Think what they went through in those 50 years from 1912, the First World War, the big conflicts of the 20s between the rise of Bolshevism, the danger of communism, the rise of new nationalism, the discontents out of the First World War. Then you have the Second World War. Then you have decolonization, the dropping of the atomic bomb. All that was in their 50-year adult memories when they gathered for Vatican II. And John the 23rd, it seems to me, is Pacem in Terris, is a real groundbreaking moment. If you read that encyclical again, first of all, he talks about, he wrote it in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis and almost on the verge of war. And at that time, we read it as kind of revolutionary because number one, it was addressed to all people of goodwill, the whole world. And indeed, people did read it. Conferences were held all over the world and around all the United Nations organizations around Pacem in Terris. Secondly, he said that war, he didn't quite say just war was out, but he said it's hard to imagine that in the nuclear age war could be justified. And that was a kind of call to peace. The third part, which was less noticed historically, is that it introduces a strong, strong emphasis on human rights. The beginning of that text is the kind of document about the commitment to human rights and human dignity and human rights. Human rights much more broadly understood than we in the United States, not just civil and religious rights, but social and economic rights. And that's really, I think, foundational for what happened in the church around the world in the years that followed. So 62 is a big turning point year, and Pacem in Terris, I think, is the text that kind of gets us there. You'll forgive me, I've kind of lost your view here. Here you are. I gotta get back. Okay, there you are. There's a lot of things we could say about Vatican II. It affirmed certainly Pope John's encyclical, but it went further. And I'd say three things about Vatican II that are crucial to Catholic social thought. First is the emphasis on Scripture, the recovery of Scripture, the effort to rethink almost everything in light, not just of the theological tradition and papal texts and the magisterium, but in terms of Scripture. And those of you who remember your friends in religious orders, they were asked to go back and reconsider their vocations in light of Scripture and the founding of their order and the needs of the church at the time. So the reintroduction of Scripture as a way of thinking about the world and of social problems is really a big turning point, I think, for Catholic social teaching. And I can come back and talk about that a little bit. The second thing to emphasize is shared responsibility. Now we know that in terms of people of God, that term, the people of God, is the whole church, all of us the baptized, being the first thing they talked about in the document on the church, and then talk about hierarchy and the rest. The church not to be thought of as the hierarchy and the Pope, but of all of the baptized together, first of all, and therefore having some sense of shared responsibility for the life and work of the church. And we know that that idea had a lot to do with the way we dealt with the council afterwards, parish and diocesan pastoral councils, lots of liturgies emphasizing the community participating in the worship and therefore in the life and work of the church. So shared responsibility within the church, but even in some ways, even more important was shared responsibility in the world. In place of the syllabus of errors, condemnation of progress, liberty, and modern civilization, you have at the first words of Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution of the church in the modern world, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the men and women of this age. These two are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Not that we're out here and we're going to work on them out there, much more that we fully identify, we fully join and participate in the whole human family as it faces the challenges of war and violence in the world. I think that's crucial for understanding where Pope Francis comes from in these days. The third thing about the council, I think, is the transformation of the teaching on peace. And John can, I'm sure, back this up, that there's a dramatic story about the lobbying that went on and people that we knew who went there and tried to work on the bishops and tried to encourage them to take on the question of nuclear weapons and the question of conscience in war more directly than the American bishops wanted to. The American bishops were on the conservative side in those debates. But in the end, the council came down with a condemnation of the arms race as an utterly treacherous trap for humanity, very strong condemnation of the arms race, and came down with the affirmation of conscientious objection, that war is a matter of conscience and that it is legitimate for a Catholic to adopt a pacifist or nonviolent position and not just follow the just war. That opened that question up in a way that it had never been opened before. Pope Pius XII had kind of suggested you couldn't be a conscientious objector and certainly was not open to pacifism and nonviolence. Now it is. So those are the three things, I think: Scripture, shared responsibility, and the dramatic teaching on war. That was so important for the United States because that document with that teaching on war came out in 1965, just as President Lyndon Johnson decided to turn Vietnam from a war where we were assisting the South Vietnamese to a direct American war. By the end of 65, there were over 100,000 American men fighting in Vietnam. So it came home, that teaching, to us at precisely the time when young men and women facing the draft had to decide what to do. And now it wasn't clear that the church was always on the side of the government, that you only had to think of yourself as a citizen. You also had to think of yourself as a disciple. When I came to Holy Cross, I taught for 4 years in Canada. I came to Holy Cross in the fall of 1969. 2 years earlier, Bishop Bernard Flanagan of our diocese, with a Jewish rabbi and with the Council of Churches, had established an interfaith draft counseling center in downtown Worcester. And I came to the campus of Holy Cross where all the men were talking about the draft. So that it was clear that this was a different world thinking about war and peace than anything that had existed before. So that's the impact. A lot of things we could say about Vatican II. I think it certainly, John the 23rd and Vatican II brought the question of war and peace into the center of Catholic social teaching where it had not been before. And there's a lot of ways I could talk a little bit about my experience 70s and 80s with the bishops, in which the social teaching on political economy and social justice side by side with the peace teachings were handled in relatively different kind of ways. I'd love to say something about John Paul II, how he carries forward the teaching on peace and human rights. The church around the world becomes a great defender of human rights in the post-war, in the Cold War era. And that's a dramatic transformation. People around the world thinking of the church as a defender of human rights. And those of us who are older can remember all the places where heroic steps were taken by Catholics to defend human rights. John and I were at the 50th anniversary of Pax Christi in Assisi in the 1990s, I guess it was, in mid-1990s. And some of the guests there were heroic young people from Central America and from Europe, who were doing remarkable, courageous work in defense of human rights under the auspices of their bishops in the church. So John Paul II, of course, carries that forward. He carried the Catholic teaching on peace, applying just war teaching in a very rigorous kind of way, more and more limiting where just war could apply. And then I think one of his most dramatic speeches in 1981 at Hiroshima, when he told a group of interfaith group and people from many backgrounds that the construction of a new international order is not a utopian ideal, but a moral imperative and a sacred duty. And Pope Francis, talking about Ukraine, could have used those same words. I think, why do we not have an international order capable of avoiding these wars between states? I'd say a word about Benedict too, and another thing. His economy is social encyclical, where he introduces the notion of an economy of gift, I think is a really important moment. And I think in his essays and encyclicals on faith, hope, and love, really, I think gives a lot of firm foundation to the re-understanding and thinking through the mission of the church in the post-Cold War era. So just a few words about Pope Francis, and I'm sure you all have many thoughts yourself on Pope Francis. Again, 50 years, when you entered Vatican II in 1962, 50 years ago is 1912, and those men had lived through all of that era. We're now 60 years after Vatican II, and we've lived through some fairly dramatic history, and thinking about what we've learned out of those 60 years is worthwhile. Certainly, the Pope has had a biography in which he's learned a lot over the years and has tried to tell us about it. I just think Pope Francis has a line where he says it's not an epoch of change, it's a change of epoch. That we're living in a very, very different world now than we were 60 or 50 years ago. And I think we certainly know that's true in the United States, where the traditional religious structures and systems and organizations just simply don't seem to work effectively as they might have when we were younger. I'll just pick up a couple of themes of his social teaching in The Joy of the Gospel, Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, the Amazon Synod. The first and most dramatic, I think, and John has said it often, is peace. That we've lived through a time when nonviolence was not allowed, if you will, and just war was the Catholic teaching. That is almost totally changed now that some of our friends think nonviolence is now the Catholic teaching. Probably Drew Christensen said it best. Nonviolence is now the central Catholic teaching, with just for war the rare exception. That's just amazing how that change has taken place in our lifetime. And in that book that John referred to, I'm sure we'll find all the very strong statements of Pope Francis, which sound like, I'm sure to many people in the United States, very new, though you can find similar lines in both Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II. There's a building up here that is in the background. It's not just Pope Francis, but that teaching is just has changed so dramatically. And I would say a number of things about it. One is it's turning, as we watch it develop around the world with Pax Christi and with other kind of peace initiatives, it's really turning peace from a kind of philosophical idea and scholasticism into a verb. It's peacemaking and peace building that people talk about today. The Catholic Relief Service initiative to create the Catholic Peace Building Network, I think, is a signal of that. That peace is something you do and you make and you have to create and you have to work at, as my friends here at Agape today are celebrating all the work that they've done for 40 years. Another thing I think is to go back to John Paul II, the need for an international order. The Vatican and the Catholic community around the world has generally supported international organization. Never before, in my judgment, have we ever seen the clear need for stronger international cooperation than today. There is no serious problem you can think about, energy, environment, terrorism, nuclear weapons, that can be solved by one nation state or by one block of nation states. They all require international cooperation. And that need for being a moral imperative and a sacred duty to strengthen our mechanisms for interstate collaboration seem to me absolutely necessary and very hard to even talk about here in the United States, maybe harder than any time in my lifetime, at least. So that's one big thing, is the peace teaching. The second, around the environment, Laudato Si, but other statements the Pope makes, is the idea that actually the earth actually matters. Actually, the whole ballgame of Christianity is about everybody and now everything. It's about God's creation. It's about the whole human family. And everything we do as Christians is within that joys and the hopes line, within the human family, not apart from it. Not teaching it all the time, but seeking to share with all of our people in the world in our common home responsibility for the planet and for the whole human family. And I think that we see Pope Francis acting on that all the time, thinking about that, praying that way. It's part of his imagination, and it's an invitation to us in our imaginations to take more seriously that possibility that how things turn out in the world actually matters. I remember when I was young, that somebody taught me the Copernican revolution of Vatican II was that this church is no longer at the center of the universe. The church is one planet going around what's at the center, which is the kingdom of God, the search for the kingdom of God. So I always, when I talk about this stuff, I want to come back to Martin Luther King, and I think he had it all in his vision. So the peace teaching, the obvious need for international cooperation and the invitations to global cooperation, the breaking down of the barriers maybe between church and world, the world actually matters, and how we deal with the world is really central to our understanding of our sense of faith. Father Brian Hare used to say Catholic social teaching really is redundant. All Catholic teaching is social teaching. All has to do with how we relate to one another. That's where Pope Benedict's, I think, letters on faith, hope, and love are really, really helpful spiritually. Third thing is the political economy. And obviously, Pope Francis, I think, brings to the discussion of social justice and the political economy the voice of the third world. And it's a voice we're going to hear, I think, from now on. That is to say that many of the things the Pope said in the beginning sounded a little harsh to American ears because it's so anti-neoliberal, which controls our mindset here. But in fact, I think it's almost common sense in much of the third world church, the churches of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Whatever their divisions about internal ecclesial matters and sometimes political matters, I think they do share a common hostility and critique of the neoliberal political economy that we in the West have created and take for granted. His support for the kind of social movements, the organizing of people, the poor, the kind of theology, popular theology, a kind of carrying on of liberation theology with a somewhat more nuanced framework, I think is really quite dramatic. So the takeaways for me from Pope Francis, and then I'll stop, we can have some discussion, are first of all, an imagination of the kingdom of God, that I think he has tried to open our imaginations to focus on what are we really after. You know how he has that thing where he jumps beyond the conflict to what might unite us beyond that? So I think in almost everything he writes, there is that sense that we are about the whole of human history. We are about a future in which a just peace is what we all seek and what we all must seek. And now it's no longer, as Pope John Paul said, no longer just a dream, but a moral imperative, a sacred duty, even a matter of survival. So that's one thing, opening up our minds about that. Pope Benedict did some of that with that theology of gift. And Joanne and I, my wife and I, have been fans of the Focolare movement. We've visited Focolare in Italy and know Focolare people here. And they have an economy of communion project that is very much trying to put into practice that notion of an economy of gift. That section, in fact, of Caritas in Veritate was really written with the help of an economist from the Focolare movement. So I think that's a lot. I think it's keeping our eye on the prize, and the prize is the beloved community. Our prize is the kingdom of God. That's one thing, opening our imaginations to that. Second is the world, everybody and everything actually matter. How it turns out actually matters. How we apply it actually matters. That the decisions that we as a human family make about nuclear weapons, about war, about the environment, about all these matters, they actually matter. It's not just we're going to kind of set up a witness and we'll go to heaven. How history turns out is somehow our shared responsibility. And those are matters that need very hard for all of us to think through that, so we're not just turning faith into the kind of a social justice agenda, but these are deep things. This is really about what the whole revelation of God in Christ is about, what it means to say that God is love. And the third is a method. And the method, of course, is the encounter idea, that how we encounter each other, how we engage people, how we practice, how we turn into practice the teaching. And later on, if we have this thing to conclude, I'll say something about politics with a small p. But I think the encounter invitation is a very important clue for us of our generation. I'm a little older than John, but why did things work out the way they did in this country with our church and the social movements? And one reason I'd say is that our pastoral strategies were not very good. Monsignor Egan always kept telling me and telling everybody else who listened to him, pastoral and social ministry have to go together. And when you separate them, they both get in trouble. And we did that. We've done that a lot. And somehow we have to figure ways to get those kind of back together. So that encounter business that the Pope keeps coming back to, I think is really important. And it's especially important if we had time to talk about the changed religious landscape of America, with the decline of denominations, the new nuns, and all this kind of Pew data about the decline of organized religion in the country. So anyways, I'll leave it at those three things: imagination, the world, our common home, and encounter, turning justice and peace, like love, into verbs. The Catholic, the Christian way, a way towards salvation. So let me stop there for a little while. I told you you'd turn me on, and I'll talk too fast and talk too long a little bit, but let me slow down there. I have a few things to say at the end, maybe we come back. Anybody have any thoughts they'd like to share? John?
Thank you very much. How about a round of applause for Dave? It's everything I hoped you'd do. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but you just walked through it all so clearly. Wasn't he fabulous, everybody? Now, I'm biased and I'm back here at Duke, my old stomping grounds, Dave, and I was a history major at Duke, so I could listen to you speak all day. Yeah, I was always interested. I majored in African American history. But you give me hope about the church. I forget, the impact of Rerum Novarum. So I want to say a few comments and ask you to respond. And while I'm doing that, folks, I want you to please write down a question in the chat box for David, or just say, John, call on me. I want to ask about this. So while you're doing that, for example, I forgot about the impact on labor that Rerum Novarum had. And I mean, when you think about the effects, or maybe decades later after these great teachings, and all of that gets me thinking, what is the impact of Francis going to be? We maybe don't even realize yet. 20, 50 years from now, he's changing the mindset of the planet and people don't even know it. Because that's what, in effect, what you said, Rerum Novarum did. The living wage, for example, the word social justice was never used before. And then now it's the world uses it. A couple of thoughts. This is heresy, so don't listen to everybody. I was so glad what you said about Pacem in Terris, because I never liked it. And yet as a kid, I read it and it was the only thing there was. I'm reading Pacem in Terris and going, this isn't about peace on earth, it's about human rights, which is very good. Don't get me wrong, but it's not calling for the abolition of war. And how do we get there? And yet, on the other hand, it was such a breakthrough. And then to think about the impact of Thomas Merton to get there, and Dorothy Day. So that's one thought. I was, David and I met Pope John Paul II together in 1995. And, he gave to a small group of us, a very emotional speech on peace that day, which shocked all of us in the room. I wasn't prepared for it, and then we ended up spending the whole day. But I never liked what John Paul was saying about peace. His speech at Hiroshima was incredible. His speech in Drogheda, Ireland, calling for the end of violence, was incredible. And then he would proceed to go ahead and justify violence in all kinds of ways. So Any more thoughts on that? Francis, on the other hand, you know, and I've been in touch with Francis from day one. You know, he wrote to me because the Jesuit world was a small world about nonviolence and about a lot of things. I asked him, David, to open a Vatican III and to make the theme Jesus. Because if you think about it, the Catholic Church has never talked about Jesus. Well, think about it. Vatican II doesn't talk about Jesus. So I think that's the big need, is that Jesus was a peacemaker, a person of nonviolence. And we're trying to get Francis, we're going back to the Vatican in December to write an encyclical on nonviolence and peace. And I've been in touch with Francis about that. But what he's done on peace has already had a big effect around the world, but not in the United States. He has completely changed everything John Paul II said on nuclear weapons, down to the fine print. You cannot have anything to do with nuclear weapons and be a Catholic, not just the death penalty. He hasn't said that per se on the just war theory, but as we keep going back and forth to the Vatican, all the cardinals now say within the Vatican, the just war theory is totally gone. And it had to do with our conference there, that the Francis has affected the cardinals in the Vatican. And that's something that's a huge accomplishment, but we haven't seen it yet to come to fruition. I guess I want to hear you say more about that. But, you know, I want you to say where you think all of this of Francis is going, like if the world survives. For example, and you forgive me for name dropping, I know Robert Redford a little bit. He was, besides being our greatest superstar, he was a real environmentalist from back in the 60s. And when Laudato Si came out and the Kyoto Accords happened, if you remember, and which was really the only hope that we've had toward climate change, and even though they weren't that good, Robert Redford said on the front page of the New York Times, there are no Kyoto Accords, there's no hope for the planet except for Pope Francis. And that's a shocking statement coming from a great behind the scenes environmental leader. And I think it's true. The world doesn't realize what, and I'm hoping next week Francis is going to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think we still don't even grasp the power of Laudato Si. And what I've been saying to Francis is I want him to, if he had written a nice letter on the environment, wouldn't that have been nice? Laudato Si is a very serious document. It's incredible. And we want him to do the same thing on peace and nonviolence and Jesus, like he did on Laudato Si. And I'm beginning to think now that he's not going to, that the church is so split and headed toward a schism, or in effect, there is a quiet schism that's happened, and he's just trying to keep the thing afloat. So I'm sharing my reactions to your talk. I want to hear what you have to say. And then, friends, I want you to open it up. This is a great chance to pick the brain of our great teacher here. Any thoughts on what I said, Dave?
Yeah, very briefly, you started with the labor. My son was former mayor of Worcester and is now the political director for the Carpenters Union in New England, upstate New York. So we think about labor a lot. One of the most hopeful things I think around is the work of a group called Bargaining for the Common Good. Bargainingforthecommongood.org. You'll see some remarkable work being done by some unions around the country. One of the guiding spirits of that is a guy named Joe McCartan, teaches labor history and runs the Kalmanovitz Center for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown. But that basic idea of the unions are supposed to be about the public interest as well as their own interests. And I think there's just some great stuff there. So Catholic teaching always had the idea that unions are one step towards some kind of full participation in sharing responsibility for our political economy. And I'd love to talk more about that because we've had some strikes in our locale and people who are doctors and a strike by the nurses over quality care. The doctors said they have no responsibility because they're now owned by a for-profit company that's headquartered in Texas. Parchment Terrace looks conservative looking back. If you read it from the point of view of Pope Pius XII, it looks groundbreaking. And if you really just think about it, David
Yeah.
Kurtzer, some of you probably have read David Kurtzer's book, first on Pope Pius XI and the Vatican, and now his new book on Pope Pius XII and the war. And you read those two books, and then you read Parchment Terrace, and you say, that's a whole different, very different.
See, that's why you're such a help to us. Historically, the context, it's a radical shift.
I read Kurtzer's most recent book on the war, and I must say I was depressed for about 3 days.
Yeah, I can't read that.
Very sad story. Laudato Si, as I've already kind of indicated, I think you're right. It's groundbreaking, that notion of a common home. We of an age have to keep asking ourselves, and I certainly do, and I don't have an answer. Way back when we had the first pictures of the Earth taken from outer space, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was going to change the imagination of the world towards a kind of sense of shared responsibility across national and ideological lines. It
Yeah.
did it.
No.
And so when Redford said that, I can say, if you depend on self-interest or global economic interdependence, doesn't seem it's going to get us there. Nothing seems it's going to get us there unless there's some kind of change of our imagination and the way in which we immediately kind of think about things. So, yeah, as for Jesus, we'll come back to Jesus. When years ago, I love Brian Hare. Brian Hare was the guiding spirit of a lot of the work of the Catholic bishops and social justice and peace issues through the Cold War. And he's a friend of mine. I really love him. I bought him out to Holy Cross one time to talk to our faculty because I knew he'd give a boost to we were just starting our peace studies program at the college. And he gave a brilliant talk. It was at the height of the 80s, the nuclear freeze movement, and moved toward the bishop's pastoral letter on nuclear weapons. And he gave his usual brilliant talk. The faculty thought it was great. They're all going to be backing the peace studies program. Only one student was there. I didn't know any students. This guy, who later became a Catholic worker, and he raised his hand in the back, the last question, and he said, "Father, that was a great talk. I learned a lot. But that whole talk, you didn't mention Jesus." And isn't that so true? That so much of our teaching in the past, and you go through Quadragesimo Anno, Rerum Novarum, we didn't mention Jesus much. It was all this kind of calculation out of a separation of nature and supernature and scholastic kind of thinking about things. And in fact, I thought that generational shift has a lot to do with where we are today, doesn't it? Huh? That there's lots of religious energy among young people. And if it's Christian, it's focused on Jesus and not on teaching. So we're all evangelicals in some sense. And the sooner we understand that, I think the better we're going to be.
Well, thank you,
I don't
David.
know if that answers all your questions.
It's great. So let's start, and I'm going to call on Brad, and there's a couple of other great questions. And Emily, I see you. If you want to at some point ask Dave a question. Brad, why don't you unmute yourself if you can and ask Dave some of your questions.
Sure. Thank you, Professor, so much for your talk. It's been fascinating. And question I had is, Peter Morin often talked about igniting the dynamite beneath the church's teachings. And I just wonder, and it was kind of consistent with your talk of encounter. And I'm wondering how we do that as individuals in our parishes and in our communities, because seems to be we're very much lone voices here, in our parishes talking about Catholic social teaching. Very few people have heard of it, much less want to really get involved with it. And are there specific steps or ideas that you would recommend? For instance, the Berrigans were often engaged in prison witness and violating immoral laws and things like that. Is that the kind of thing that social teachings would cover, Catholic social teaching would cover?
Well, I think it kind of covers some, but Brad, I'm not going to be able to give you a full answer to that. I'm like kind of saying from my own experience, the things that I find helpful. I don't think our Catholic schools, we don't have as many of them, and those that do exist, I think are wonderful. And the Jesuits, Nativity and Cristo Rey schools are remarkable. So there's some good things going on, but in general, our older strategies don't seem to work that well. So let me just call attention to a couple of things. One is the movements, right? Focolare, San Egidio, the Communion Liberation. There's a Jesuit who's just finished the thesis at the New School in New York. He's teaching in Loyola in Chicago now. And he spent a lot of time with those three movements in their New York City places. And I think there's some hints there as to what the future, how we might build a better future. And in all three, the emphasis of his study is on the practices, how these movements try to practice a certain kind of piety that certainly is a peacemaking and justice-seeking piety, but to practice that in the concrete circumstances of their daily life, to assist each other to do that, to have time to step back and reflect among themselves, but to live out the gospel in the midst of daily life. And I'm just so encouraged by those movements because I think that's where we didn't quite figure that out. The Chicago School of Catholic Social Action years ago wanted us to focus more on the laity and how to think about bringing the faith to practice in the professions and in the workplace. And we never figured out a good pastoral strategy to do that. So we didn't think hard, I think, about the way the religious culture was changing and the new pastoral strategies that would be needed. So that's number one. Number two is, of course, I think my friends here at Agape and Plowshares and all these movements, I'm in great admiration of them. But I've always had reservations. I think they're a witness. I think the Catholic Worker houses the mustard seed. Charles Taylor, the great philosopher, says the future of Christianity and of Catholicism is going to be mustard seeds scattered around. People, joy of the gospel, attraction, more persuasion, people living the faith in a rich and fulfilling way that are attractive to people. And I think the Catholic Worker movement has been something like that. Ours is named the mustard seed. And when people think if Jesus came to town, where would he show up? That's one of the places he'd probably show up. So thinking a little bit more about practice, how do we take these ideas and turn them into practice in the concrete circumstances in which we live? Break through the secular, all that kind of stuff about secularism and all that, church against the world. Just simply try to think through in the concrete circumstances that people face, how do they live out the gospel? So there's this huge pastoral challenge, I think, and our resources for pastoral work are not what they used to be. So that's why I don't have a good answer. I used to say, let's get into the seminaries and let's get into the lay ministry training programs and we'll train all those people and they'll go out and help the laity. But the system just is, the infrastructure is just changed a lot. And we're not sure how to do these things other than, I think, encouraging the movements and encouraging young people when they get together and they want to do things to try to be present to that. I don't know if that probably doesn't help very much, but I don't have a pastoral plan at the moment. I'm working on it though.
It's great, David. I want to ask you, Tom, if you want to unmute Tom Kranich, because your question is sort of like all of that about, well, so what do you think is the future of all of Catholic social teaching? And I'll let Tom ask David that if you want.
Look, thanks very much. I'm here in Australia, and I was encouraged by what you said in terms of the impact of Rerum Novarum, and that certainly had a huge impact on our early history as a nation. But like a lot of us, we get to a point where you've taken us through this fantastic historical journey, and it's been quite interesting. But at the moment, I'm struggling, probably similar to the last question. I'm struggling to see how we make this great body of work relevant in a time of great secularism and where there's great distrust of the church in the world. I work as a lawyer. I often help people in compensation claims, and I sit across, I sit across from the church's lawyers in some of these negotiations and discussions, and cannot believe they come out of the same. They're getting instructed by the same body that instructed me throughout my Catholic life and Catholic education journey. So how do we make real these Catholic social teachings into the future in an era of great distrust of the church.
Thank you, Tom. David?
Wow. Tom, I share a little of that feeling with the lawyers. I don't dislike lawyers, but my College of the Holy Cross, when I'm retired from, has been through some sex abuse questions, and they've had a series of investigations. And the last report just came out from the president. And when I read it, I just felt so depressed because it's so legalistic. There's just so much legalism about it. And the hint in it, I think, is that a pastoral response is a weakness almost. So it just, I didn't know what to do about it. I just feel badly about it. I just feel that the spirit of it was so different than I think what we used to feel we had at the community. So I feel that. I don't have a really great answer to this. I think we have to think a little bit. There's a woman named Christine Führer-Heinze, Hinze, and her most recent book is called Radical Sufficiency. And it's the application of John Ryan teaching, trying to update that for the American political economy we face today. And I really liked that. I thought it was a really good kind of effect. Again, it's a bit of a dream now, but some of the things in there are things we do dream about, but that's where I call attention to something like bargaining for the common good, which are in fact teachers unions in Chicago and Los Angeles and other places. There is some good things going on there. Her husband, Brad Heinze, has been a theologian who's given a lot of support to bottom-up grassroots community organizing, which was the central form of domestic Catholic social action, I think, in the United States through much of our history, labor organizing, and then Alinsky-style community organizing. It still is very strong and it's very important. And anything we can do to revive that bottom-up community organizing, I think, is a really good idea. One of the things bargaining for the common good people have been able to do is to build in some communities relationships between neighborhood groups, community groups, and labor groups to work together. And my son, when he went to work for the Carpenters, had some very funny stories about how they don't go talk to each other because they think the other side doesn't like them, the neighborhood groups and the community groups. But in fact, they really have a lot in common. And if you can build good communication, they find some new common ground to work together. But the church has got me puzzled. I do have a sense, I tell people personally to try to think of themselves within the Christian movement, the Jesus movement, if you will. And Jesus movement is still alive and cooking in all kinds of ways. You can't drive through a city in the United States without seeing new storefront churches or third floor last chance church upstairs. And even in the suburbs, you find a lot of new churches. So there's a lot of religion perking around. We had too little dialogue with evangelicals and Pentecostals. We should have had a lot more dialogue with them because there's a lot of energy out there. And there's a lot of changes taking place in those communities. Don't believe the polls. The polls often tend to pull in the people that are most politically engaged and right-wing causes. But I think there's a lot of questions being asked in more conservative congregations, evangelical and Pentecostal congregations I think there'll be a lot about abortion now in the practice of it. And there certainly has been a lot on the environment. So ecumenism, I think we were too soft. We thought it was a relationship between settled groups are falling apart. It's a deeper kind of challenge, isn't it? And it's back to Jesus, I think, John Deere. What would Jesus do? That's really the question a lot of our people ask these days, isn't it? Just like they did in the late 19th century in the social gospel. Mm-hmm. And we've got to figure out how to bring this richness of the Catholic intellectual social justice tradition into a rich and constructive relationship with popular Christocentric piety, if you will.
That's the big question. Now, Carol, we have a similar question related from Carol Shelton. I will read it. It's basically, what keeps you hopeful about all of this? And she's commenting that you seem hopeful, enthusiastic as you trace the history, because the history was progressive and widening and becoming more enlightened. She writes, your enthusiasm and hope about Catholic social teaching is surprising, given the total lack of that message among the US bishops. What makes you hopeful? And if I could leave her question there. So that's, share some of us, like, and what have you learned studying this? And yeah, clearly it's given you some hope for the global church, especially leading up to Francis.
Well, yeah, that's, I suppose that the personal answer we all have is people that I've known. Pope Francis says in Joy of the Gospel, right, that it's this attraction and not persuasion. And I've known people, and I know people whose faith, like these people here at Agape for 40 years, have been trying every day in very difficult situations to live out the gospel fully, dealing with nuclear weapons and, getting arrested, capital punishment, visiting people on death row. They do it every day, and they certainly give me hope that that they've persisted over a lifetime and done it with some degree of good nature and seem to be happy in later life. So the joy of the gospel does work, I think, some in mysterious ways. So that's the personal, I guess, answer. And with our kids and our grandchildren, I think we try to talk to them about faith, that churches are complicated and dealing with churches and the politicization of churches, but what really is important is faith and not losing faith. Faith that the things you believe in most deeply are in fact true. And that's where we've gotten help with Jesuit spirituality. We did the 19th annotation. We have some of that ourselves, and we try to share some of that. Some of you may know the name Michael Himes, who was a wonderful theologian at Boston College. He just died recently. And if you get a chance some night and you want to feel inspired and feel hopeful, Michael gave something called the last lecture about 6 years before he died. It's a thing they do on campuses these days, ask you if you were giving your last lecture, what would you say? And Michael's last lecture, which I listened to the other day, was a source of great inspiration and hope for me. How you carry that faith through very complicated times that we're living in, if we really believe this business that God is love, and therefore love is God, and agape love is what it's all about, and you hope you have had, and we've had in our lives some experience of that, some touch of that. And when you study Catholic workers, you find most of them know it's a mess most of the time, but once in a while, there's that moment when you think this is kind of like the kingdom of God. Anyway, I got some funny stories about that. But so I think those are the things that keep you alive. And what do? I think if I could send Holy Cross students to Focolare and San Egidio centers in Europe and in Australia and Latin America, they'd come back, I think, fired up for the faith and for the Jesus movement, the Christian movement, as having important things to say to the rest of the world. Yeah.
Thank you, David. I'll call on Emily, but first there are two questions about nuclear weapons. So if you want to think about Catholic social teachings. So Peter from Needham there, hi Peter, he says, what are your thoughts specifically about the global Catholic Church and the movement toward nuclear disarmament as you consider the leadership of the popes? I mean, what Francis has done is quite incredible. And then somebody else, maybe it was you, Ryan, asked about if you could comment. We were talking about it earlier about Archbishop Wester's pastoral letter in New Mexico and how he's trying to apply Pope Francis here in the United States. And as you know, I've been working with him on that. So any specific thoughts about nuclear weapons per se in light of Catholic social teaching?
Well, obviously, the first thing is we used to have all these discussions about possession and use, and and now they're settled, aren't they, as far as the teaching of the church goes, that the possession, threatened use, much less the use, is utterly condemned and should be condemned. And and to take it to the question of possession, as you know, poses not just political challenges, but pastoral challenges. We have a lot of our friends and neighbors who are in the military or are in military related work. So that's been around for a long time. We know it's a challenge. I knew Bishop Sullivan well down in Virginia. I visited him and saw what he did. And he had all these military installations in his diocese. So he was a strong, nonviolent Pax Christi bishop. And his strategy was basically just to show up, to be there with them, to tell them what he was thinking, to ask what they were thinking, to respect what they said in return, but to try to have a kind of dialogue, and especially a strong pastoral presence with good parishes in those neighborhoods. So there's a huge pastoral challenge, but it's such a grace that this is developed. And it's not just Pope Francis, you know that. It's all the things that have happened with other popes and other statements have been made. There's no turning back on this.
No.
We've got just war. The Pope on his way home says he understands why you send some weapons. We all feel that, don't we? We don't want to abandon the people of Ukraine. So it's a struggle, but I think the basic Christian message has changed. The basic Catholic message has certainly changed. And it's up to us to figure out pastoral and political strategies. Now, in the United States politically, as you know, it's really, really hard. I get stunned at how little discussion there is of international cooperation. It's just beyond me. In my simple thing, John Kerry was the last one to take a shot at it when he was working for the nomination in 2004. And he made some statements about the needs for the United Nations and international cooperation and peacekeeping. And he got blasted for it and he shut up. And when he got to be Secretary of State, I thought he did try to do some things that way. But basically, as a public discussion, it's gone. And because I have some friends and I keep in touch with the things the United Nations does, the right to responsibility to intervene and protect, and arms trade, small arms, large arms, conventions that they've made. Here they're talking about war crimes. Of course, we haven't even joined the International Criminal Court, right? We're not. So it's so hard these days to talk about international cooperation, and President Trump, of course, made it even harder, where the Democrats have to show their favor in making America great again, too. So that's such a dark, treacherous hole to go down. It's really scary. So I don't know, like you, I've been talking about the modernization question of nuclear weapons for 5 or 6 years. I mean, decisions were made quite a while ago, and Obama carried them out as much as everybody else. And it seems to me to be both not just immoral, but stupid. It just seems to be dumb. And yet all over the world, people are spending enormous amounts of money to modernize and try to make usable these nuclear weapons. And the level of political discourse about it is so impoverished. Huh? I mean,
Yeah.
I have 2 sons in politics, one son in politics a lot. He's now running the Carpenters politics. And he shares all this, but you can't have a conversation with those folks about international cooperation or nuclear modernization. They their eyes glaze over, And it's too bad.
This is one of the ways the Catholic Church in the United States has so radically shifted under the far right, is how the bishops, becoming Republicans, have shut down conversations. And that's what Wester tries to do. So one of the things, you knew Dorothy Day, right, Dave?
Oh, only a little.
Yeah.
I
You know that one aspect of her life that is never discussed is she's traipsing around the country on a bus all the time. She's always stopping in seminaries and giving informal talks. And in the 50s and the 60s, the seminaries, every seminary in the country had lectures on Pacem in Terris and Mater Magistra and Vatican II. All of that is stopped. And now in the United States, basically no Catholic parish is allowed to bring in a speaker without the permission of the bishop, which would say Dorothy Day would never be allowed to speak anywhere now. Now the seminaries are not allowed to have any visitor, period, no speaker, which means they're not being taught Catholic social teaching, and they're not being updated on Francis's thinking. And because that's how the church is created, priests top down. It's a huge loss. I'm kind of speechless about it, that the new priests don't know anything about Catholic social teaching, and I blame the bishops for that. But folks, if you wanted something to do, start agitating the bishops on teaching about getting their priests to talk about Catholic social teaching. Emily's got a follow-up on all this, taking you into the question of the gospel and nonviolence. Emily, go ahead, unmute yourself. David, this is a friend from New Mexico, and she was in Pax Christi as a young person. Welcome,
Yes.
Emily.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Dave. So I'm a teacher and a mother. And it's very much, I feel just like I'm getting pushed from a wind behind me. And I didn't ask for, to really bring to approach young people. Like, I mean, I know so many of them, being a mother and a teacher of a 14-year-old. In my community in New Mexico, I know, many teens who are really, their heart is there and they're so interested in questions of social justice and peace. And then, but they're not, they have like zero religious background or anything really, that as far as I can tell from what the conversations we have. And then I know young Catholic, kids in high school, and they have only heard, not that it's an only, because it's beautiful, but they've had like the evangelical sort of almost seems like in Catholicism. And I feel so, I want to, like, how do we put them together? How can I help put them together? How do I help bring the gospel of Jesus and the message of how profoundly these kids are loved, the ones who the only thing they've ever heard about, Christianity or Catholicism tends to be, the mistakes that have been made in the past that have nothing to do with what Jesus said. And then the kids who are Catholic, who've only ever heard, like, they've heard the pious message, but they've never heard the social teaching. And I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on working with, I mean, you were at a college for many years. I'd just love to hear your thoughts on bringing this message to high school age and maybe college too.
Yeah, I wish I could give you a really good answer to that. I know that people I know, younger mothers and families, you try through their own contacts, often with the college, to find young families who care about these things, put them in touch with each other, invite the kids to go on retreats together, meet each other and get some reinforcement for each other that what I'm thinking is other people have those same feelings. And it's the organizing thing, I guess, that has to begin from the bottom up. And I know what we're all doing, right? We search for the parish or the community that seems to have a good program where the young people are getting nourished intellectually and spiritually, and then we'll join that church. And one of my grandchildren families, they ended up in the Unitarian Church, and I laughed because years ago I debated Peter Steinfels before a big audience, and he actually said, Dave, if we followed your advice, we'd all end up Unitarians. And so I called him up the day I found out that my son and his family had joined the Unitarian Church. And so Peter was right. So I guess that's the best thing we do. We try to find ways in which these young people can find other people who feel like they do. And certainly that's what campus ministry does, right? The best campus ministries do that. Our Pax Christi group at Holy Cross, one of the few real vigorous Catholic Pax Christi groups on Catholic campuses, but it always was that gathering place for the kind of justice and peace oriented students who could support each other and then become student leaders and carry that message out. And it's the old organizing work, I guess, we try to do. So, the country's very big. I found that out a long time ago. And different places are different. New England, the church is in such a mode of declension. Everybody talks decline. And but I know that's not true everywhere. New Mexico and Southwest is probably very much more positive and forward-looking, perhaps because you've got more traditional families who aspire towards a better life, and the church has been supportive of their effort to educate their kids and help them move ahead in the world. The Jesuit schools, as you can find, nativity schools and Cristo Rey schools are, the nativity school in our community is a very creative center that's had a lot of impact on kids in minority neighborhoods. Even the students there become almost ambassadors of of good thinking and stuff in the community. So I guess I'm wishing we had back some of those vigorous youth ministers of the 70s and 80s in the diocese that I worked with, who were just so creative and so good at doing exactly what you're looking for. And as John said, so many of these things have gotten lost in the post John Paul II era. Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. I see Julie, you have your hand up. You have a brief question. You can unmute yourself, Julie. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
There you go.
Yes. With young Catholics in their 20s and 30s becoming more and more nuns, how can they become inspired to become more engaged in Vatican II?
Well, that's one of the pastoral challenges. A lot of people are writing books about the new nuns. They're not antagonistic often toward religion. They're not atheists in some classic kind of way. So there's a lot of spiritual energy there. There's a lot of idealism. And the pastoral effort has got to be to try to figure out how to touch that. And I think a lot of that, if you visit Catholic campuses, Catholic campus ministry and the Jesuit schools is very good at reaching out to kids who are going through that kind of disaffiliation process. Where it's all going to end up, I wish I had a better sense of that. But I do think, let me just say, I was going to say three things at the end. One is dreams, right? I often tell people, if you want to really get a handle on the world we face, the last days of Martin Luther King and where to go. A book called Down Jericho's Road tells the story of Memphis and what he found in Memphis when he came to Memphis. And just read his words, those last days, the last talk he gives. He goes to bed, they get him up at night, and he gives that last talk before he's murdered the next morning. And you understand where he was living. And then pick up his last book that was published after his death called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And if there's one thing to get out of that for me, it's a dream idea. That way back in the 70s and 80s, I thought the biggest change in the 60s was not a change in religion, it's Christian religion, it was a change in American religion, the loss of confidence in the American promise. Our church was built in this country out of memory and aspirations. The loss of aspirations, the loss of trust and confidence in the country and in the future. Truly, truly important. And Martin Luther King's dream, if you will, in those last speech, holding on to that dream. That's really, I think, what Pope Francis and another way Benedict, I think, have really reinforced. You've got to have that vision of the faith in the coming of the kingdom, right? The kingdom is going to come and we can help to bring it about. The second is realistic hope. Pope Francis uses that talking about St. Joseph. Think of what St. Joseph dealt with, and yet he talk about change, right? He's going to have this baby. It's not even his baby, and the baby's going to save the world, but the secular authorities want to kill him. It's not like he didn't have confidence. I mean, his whole world around him is upset, but he trusted the Lord and trusted to carry out what Pope Francis calls realistic hope. And the third is organizing, that we simply have to get better again at organizing. Catholics in this country built an amazing lives for themselves with political organizing, union organizing, ethnic organizing, and organizing these churches. They were built from the bottom up for the most part until well into the 20th century. They came out of people's aspirations. So organizing, so dreams, keeping dreams alive. Have Langston Hughes, hold fast to dreams, because if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Realistic hope. That is, hope is the crucial thing here, but realistic hope out of the fabric of daily life to keep hope alive. And the third is organizing. And I guess that's what I said to that last woman, to reach out, try to find people of similar kind of interests, organize it to support one another, and to let the public know that there are other ways of looking at things. Yeah, anyway, thank you all for listening. You're so good.
Thank you so much, David. How about a round of applause for David? You really I felt very excited and inspired. Thank you for walking us through Catholic social teaching. It was a pleasure to listen
Thank
to
you
you.
all for being interested. It's just really, really nice. Yeah.
Great. And just a little announcement that in 2 weeks, we're going to have a session on Dr. King with a great young new writer and activist named Kazu Haga, going through Dr. King's 6 principles of nonviolence. So I hope you can all make it.
Good.
So we'll wrap it up there. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks so very much. David, all the best. I'll be in
Thank you for having
touch.
me. I'm really very, very grateful.
All right. Take care, everybody. And thank you so much.